And we turn to the Zohar in Tazria, where again and I say insignificant because it is so, an insignificant aspect of what happens when a boy is born. It says that the woman is unclean for 33 days. I am referring to, I'll give you the exact chapter so you know what we're referring to. In Leviticus chapter 12, verse 2. If a woman be delivered and bear a man-child, a male, then she shall be unclean 7 days, as in the days of the impurity of a sickness shall be unclean. And in the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. And here, on this particular verse, we have for the first time an idea, says the Zohar, because he ties it in with the aspect of giving birth, the connection. And he says, I had a piece of paper in here so I wouldn't have to spend this time. Okay, here it is. Why must there be a circumcision on the 8th day and not before? Because Yom HaShmini is referring to the Brit Kodesh. Now we know that the Eva, the organ, the male sex organ, is Sfirat Yesod. Sfirat Yesod is indicated because Sfirat Yesod means the Vav, and therefore the male sex organ appears as a Vav for no other reason, because it represents Yesod. It represents that bottled up energy which is referred to by a code name Yesod, foundation. Why is it a foundation? Because wherever this Sphira is found, it is as Joseph. From there flows all of the abundance and blessings that the world required. And so the narration about Joseph being in Egypt and being in control and nourishing the entire world was due to one factor. He was Yesod. From Yesod flows all of the abundance to Malchut, to our world. Shehu Shmini lekol hamadregot. And the Brit Milah is to remove the Olah, because by Orlah, the foreskin, is the embodiment of all negative energy concentrated in one place, in one aspect, that there is no concentration of such negative energy anywhere, not only within the physical body, but within any aspect of this universe. And why is it located in that particular place, the foreskin, not somewhere else? Because it is Yesod, and there is another pasuk, quotes the Zohar, Lepeta chatat rovetz, just as we put a mezuzah on the doorpost. What is the reason for putting a mezuzah on the doorpost? Because wherever there is an opening for energy to flow, that is where you will find what is called the Sitra Achra. You will find Satan. You will find all of those negative energy intelligences that cause troubles for individuals, for society, for the whole universe. He knows where energy is to be found. And because the highest concentration of energy is to be found in the male sex organ, because there is nothing more powerful than the sperm that can produce an entire generation, an entire human race, as it did with Adam. Intelligent people, different kinds of people. It has this quality, a power that has no equal in our universe. And since from that point flows this kind of energy, there you will find the greatest concentration of negative energy. Ze le'umad ze asa Elokim, said Solomon. Wherever you will find evil, you find good. Both in the same place, as we said with the poison ivy tree. If you want to know where the cure for poison ivy lies, right next to it, in another tree that always grows together with poison ivy. So wherever you find negativity, you will always find its cure of positivity. Therefore, because of this high concentration, which is called the orla, the foreskin, to permit an unadulterated flow of energy, of high-powered energy, the reason for the Brit Milah, is to remove that foreskin. At the Brit, for those of you familiar or unfamiliar with it, we invite Elijah the prophet. Why is he invited? Because Elijah the prophet made a statement that the Jews have forsaken God. That's what he said. Jews have forsaken God, and meaning they had neglected Brit Milah, and because of that, Elijah now is commanded, not requested, but is commanded by God to be present at every Brit Milah. And what we think is only a custom of inviting Eliyahu to the Brit, we shall learn that if he is not invited, the Brit has not been completely fulfilled. That is not known. Well, according to Rabbi Shimon, and if he can be considered someone who can provide us with halacha, well, he is a witness. Now, first of all, we're going to raise many questions concerning this aspect of Elijah. Why him? Why him? Furthermore, is this deemed to be a kind of punishment? In other words, because Elijah said the Jews have forsaken the covenant, and therefore he should be punished by demanding his presence to be at every Brit. He was telling the truth. And for telling the truth, is that deemed a reason for him to be punished because he told the truth? And what happens when he's there? Okay, so now he has to be at every Brit. So what? Now he's present.
Somebody's telling the truth in his face.
What's that? Someone's telling him, don't you see, the Jews have not. But the only place he finds himself present is those who are performing the Brit. Does that mean everybody performs the Brit? He can just as well go to a place where a child has been born, as happens today in many cases, more so even in Russia, where we have personal contact with people who refuse to have circumcision, because if a Holocaust comes again, that would be the one area that they could not determine whether his child would be Jewish or not, and therefore they do not want their children to be circumcised. Because if a Holocaust, and we've heard that, not from one case, and from many cases, and therefore, in Russia in particular, and amongst many Jews, the Brit is not performed. So, when Elijah is invited to be present, he can say, yes, okay, they didn't, but what about all the others who did? Another important question is, how does Elijah get to all of these Brit at the same time? I mean, you can have maybe 50 or 100 throughout the world, and he's got to be present at all of them. Furthermore, if we say he has to be there, we're assuming that it is a punishment. Don't you see, Elijah? There are people performing the Brit. Okay, he agrees. Now there are. I mean, why would Rabbi Shimon say, but if you don't invite him? It is almost as if the Brit had not been performed.
Almost, or it's not?
Well, I don't want to say completely that it is not performed, but we will learn how much of the Brit was not accomplished. All right? Now, why Elijah? Why Elijah? All of the prophets have always criticized the Jew. Jeremiah, not in this vein, but Jeremiah and Isaiah and many other prophets who reprimanded the Jews for not keeping the mitzvot. Why Elijah?
Some connection to Pinchas.
Well, the only connection with Pinchas, I don't want to say the only connection because that is the connection, but we're running a little ahead, is that Pinchas or Eliyahu was an incarnation of Pinchas. So there is a strong connection between the two. They both repeated the same words. They would kano kineti. In other words, God is a jealous God, and I took revenge for the sake of God. And they both said the same, recited the same expression. Why 8 days? Why is that so necessary? Says the Zohar in Parshat Tazria, just as there was a Genesis 1, if you recall, we discussed Genesis 1, and I'll have to touch on it briefly again. Genesis 1 saw the creation, 7 days of creation. And only after the 7 days of creation, what does it say? Then Adam, as if Adam wasn't born, we brought out that contradiction. It says male and female, he created them on the 6th day, and yet in Genesis 2, meaning chapter 2, the Bible goes through a complete discourse on how Adam was created. He was assembled from the earth, from the dust of the earth, and therefore he was called Adam because he was taken from Adamah. And then it tells us from a rib of Adam was created Eve. But yet on the 6th day it said already that male and female, he created them on the 6th day of Genesis 1. Then what is Genesis 2 about? We briefly answered that particular problem by stating that Genesis 1 is dealing with metaphysics, and Genesis 2 is dealing with the actualization of Genesis 1. In other words, Genesis 1 was all potential, and Genesis 2 is the actualization. The Zohar says, as Genesis 1 was the precedent on how things operate in our universe, the first 7 days, meaning the first 7 sfirot, before anything can become actualized, as we learn in Talmud Esses Sfirot, it must go through a process of 7 to become actualized. Just as in Genesis 2, Adam was created on a physical level, became actualized, that which already began in Genesis 1. When 7 days, meaning 7 sfirot, or 7 vessels, become established, then, says the Zohar, the soul, which now has to become imprisoned, so to speak, within a body. We know the dichotomy between the soul and the body. The soul is one of a desire to receive for the sake of sharing. The body has its opposite characteristic of a desire to receive for oneself alone. And how do these two become joined, united, as one operating actualization of the soul? Says the Zohar, the soul does not become actualized until the 7 sfirot, until those 7 vessels, 7 aspects of a total vessel become established. Once those 7 vessels, or the 7 sfirot, like in Genesis 1, became established, then you can have actualization. Therefore, says the Zohar, the necessity of 7 days to pass over, meaning 7 sfirot, become established, 7 particular types of energies that must become established within this physical frame called the newborn, and before the soul can become part and united with this body, it must first find its habitat on a level of metaphysics. It must have the establishment of 7 days, as Genesis 1 required 7 days before Adam could become actualized. So, this unification between the soul and the body could never take place until the 8th day, because until that 8th day, it does not have its proper vessel by which it can now become enclosed. Therefore, it was necessary to have these 7 days before any type of energy, real energy, because the body is only robotic in relation to the soul. We all know that at death, what happens with the body and what happens with the soul. Obviously, death means, and there it indicates to us what the body is really all about. The body is nothing without a soul. Death means the soul has left. Therefore, the body has no function by and within itself, has no energy, in fact, to continue by and within itself, other than the energy that it receives and the energy that it is united with when the soul makes its presence felt. Therefore, since the soul cannot make its presence felt until the 8th day, until there's a completion of the 7 days, therefore, before that, before this force called the soul can become manifest, we need 7 days. Now, the moment that soul becomes manifest within this body, the force becomes manifest. At that point, the foreskin that was created is like the poison ivy and the tree. The Zohar says to permit a flowing of energy, unobstructed, would necessitate having the Satan. In other words, each individual male must have its counterpart. If there is a soul, the anti of that soul, it must also be present, because one without the other does not exist. So that foreskin takes in the embodiment of negativity not before the 8th day, because the soul, what does negative energy want? What is its ultimate desire? to suck, to draw to itself any energy, because that's the lifeblood of negative energy. It can only take energy from something that is positive, like the soul. If the soul is not there, it has no purpose. So when the foreskin is removed, let's say on the 6th day or the 5th day, we are removing a foreskin without internal energy. Because as long as that soul is not there, the consciousness and energy intelligence of the Satan, who is at Lepeta Chatat Rovetz, who will always be found, like the mezuzah, will be found at a doorpost, at an entrance, from which and from whence this kind of energy flows. He is smart enough to know that the train didn't arrive on day 6. The train doesn't arrive until day 7. He knows exactly when that train of energy is there for him to be able to draw to himself that kind of energy. And therefore, only on the 8th day, because that is when the soul ultimately finds its place and is united with the body, that at that moment, that negative energy also settles into its place, called the Orla, called the foreskin. And I don't want to get into the validity of what this foreskin says, because scientists seem to want to indicate that the greatest amount of, is it bacteria or
interferon?
Well, interferon is what bacteria.
Right.
The greatest concentration
It's in the foreskin.
is in the foreskin. Okay, if bacteria is evil, then okay, I'll agree with it. But I'm
Bacteria is healthy.
that's right. But they claim also if they can develop interferon from the foreskin,
So they use.
they might have the cure for cancer. Again, I'm just throwing this out, not as to make valid the reason for circumcision.
Are you saying that the Satan is manifest in the foreskin?
Yes.
On the 8th day.
On the 8th day, not before.
And he's at the opening.
That's right.
In the manifestation.
That's right. So if the foreskin would be removed before, if the foreskin is removed before the 8th day, a piece of meat was simply removed. And therefore, the halacha says, what was the purpose? On the 8th day, that's when he's going to come in. And if he doesn't have his share, and we learn about that because we've given a little beginner's course on Brit Milah, we know that he must also always be fed. Always. It's like on the Shabbat, the Ari would always cut off a little piece. Why would he cut off a little piece? Because that he would give first to the Satan. Thinking, look, and then what is the Satan ego? Do you imagine how much ego? He's the one who gets the first portion. Can you imagine? This is, in a similar sense, the idea of the foreskin, which we'll come to.
That's how he keeps him checked also.
What's that?
That's how he keeps him checked.
You keep him in check by that way. That's right.
You follow him this way.
That's right. That's right.
What happens when the kid is sick and you have to make the brit after?
Okay, now, what has also happened, since now we understand the importance of the 8th day, not the 7th and not the 9th, therefore, when I quoted you in Genesis, the importance of ki be'etzim hayom hazeh, if you remember in chapter 17, and that's where the halacha is derived from, that it must be in that day. The importance of that day. And it should be as early as possible, too, in the morning. But that's another aspect we leave for the present. Not in the afternoon. And not on Sunday, when it's convenient. Well, most people are off on Sunday. They can all come and participate in the Brit. All right? What's that?
You're doing it early also for the convenience.
Earlier than the seventh day. If Sunday should be on the fifth day.
No,
They do it
earlier in
before
the
the
day.
day?
Earlier in the day. In the day.
Early in the day.
The convenience.
It should be.
I mean, it's good.
Shouldn't
No,
it
no.
be better in the afternoon where the negativity is the strongest?
Right. However, that would be a great idea. That's when we can get in not only the Satan, but then we have all of his accompaniment, which begins on after 12. However, what you're in effect saying is, but meanwhile we'll leave him alone and he'll be present. Is that correct? We're giving him some time to make contact with the soul to whatever extent.
You don't want to.
Now we don't want that, and therefore it says in the morning, as early as possible, in Chesed,
On our territory.
in our turf, on our turf, and not on his turf, because the afternoon is negative.
Not to let the Satan touch the keter of.
That's right. And this we're dealing with the Keta. That's right, the Atara, which is called the Keta, because
That should be the night before.
the night. Then why shouldn't it be now in the night, right? If it should be so early.
So this should be night before.
Good question. Why shouldn't it be done at night? The answer would be, if I was a usual rabbi, I would say, but I just quoted you the verse. Be'etzim hayom hazeh. During the day. It says be'etzim this day, but also hayom, during the day, not during the night.
Etzem,
Okay.
it means what? In the core of it, Etzem.
Yes, right there, right at its
Smack the
beginning.
middle.
That's right. Now, why not at night? As I said, therefore it's mentioned, it's got to be during the day. But we already said, beside, the reason why we're not making that Brit in the afternoon is because we want to do that kind of operation on our turf. It is like we said people should be married the first 10 days of the month, right? Why the first 10 days? And until the 15th, but preferably the first 10 days, because we know the month is divided into three aspects. How do we know that it's divided into three aspects? Take a look at the moon. You see the position of the moon, and we know what governs the moon. It's not the moon governs itself, meaning it decided, but rather there are metaphysical forces that determine when there is a rising moon, when there is a descending moon, and in the middle, when it rises a little and falls a little. The best time is when the moon ascends. Why? Because then is the time of Chesed, and therefore marriages should only be performed during the first 10 days of a month, except on one day of the year. What's that? Well, naturally, this is talking only to those who have not as yet put down a deposit for the banquet hall, right?
Too bad.
What's that?
Too bad.
Well, the 15th is okay, but I'm speaking now what happens after the 15th. The 15th is full moon, so it's fine. It means that there is a complete unified whole going on, and that's without getting into the details, but the moon represents a complete unified whole. The 16th day and onwards is a day when negativity begins to set in. And therefore, weddings should not be performed after. But there is one day in the year, and that is Lag BaOmer, which always occurs on the 18th day of Iyar, the 18th day of the Hebrew month of Iyar, meaning the moon has already begun to descend, but that, of course, is the day of Rabbi Shimon, and of course, as much light as you get on that day, no matter what's happening with the moon, we're on a good turf with Rabbi Shimon, so there's no problem. But the reason why we do not do it at night, because night you have the dominion of all of the demons and whatever, and again we don't want to be on his turf because this is a serious operation. It is a serious operation, and therefore the requirement that it be performed in the morning and not at night or in the afternoon is because the energy intelligence of chesed, of mercy, compassion, should be present. Because while we are removing the foreskin, and which is the embodiment of this negative energy consciousness of the Satan, nowhere is he so embodied as he is in that foreskin. During the evening, since he is present and the soul is present, but it's on his turf that this circumcision is taking place. And therefore, the Torah, when it says during the day and in the morning, should be when everything is taking place on our turf, when Chesed is present.
Regarding the wedding or anything else, if that matter, and it's not because it's sitting on my mind. I was thinking about it the other day, as a matter of fact. Don't we say Saf Maaseh Machshavat Echila?
Which means?
Which means everything that is already integrated in the brain, which is already being cooked,
Is already programmed.
Okay.
That is correct.
Now, if two would decide to get married today, when do we start counting the negative time? Suppose I'm going out to the girl, just an example.
Don't,
And the first
and
10
in
days
the
of
future, when you meet your bat zug, don't make the decision at the end of the month.
Okay, so that particular moment that she and I
Decide.
decided to go ahead and do it in 3 years from now, it doesn't matter. What date do count? The date that we agreed upon, because of Maaseh.
That also is injected because there is Genesis 1 and there is Genesis 2. There is the potential and the actualization. So what I'm suggesting is to be certain that the potential and the actualization should both occur before the 15th day of the month.
What is stronger then?
Well, I would have to go
here.
into probably how many discussions on actualization. We discussed that again so fully. Which is more important, the fruit or the seed? Well, is the seed? Do you eat seeds or you rather eat the fruit? Okay, so that's the chicken and the. So this is not the place for us. Right, that's catch-22. We can't get into that discussion. No.
What about if it's on the 8th day? Most of the times it won't be full 7 days. Does it not count?
As long as there is it must be at least 7 days that have gone by. You're saying it's not complete. Let's say, that's right, but because the child, let's say, was born in the afternoon, okay? Child was born in the afternoon. That day already counts. Because, that's right.
It shouldn't be 24 hours.
That's right. It does not require 24 hours. It requires day.
In its sunset.
What's that?
7 sunset.
Yes. Yes, it requires 7 sunsets. That's correct. That's right. That's right.
I
Yes.
don't ask this because abortion is a hot topic now, but what implications does this have for,
Has
nothing to do with it at all?
that
The
conversation.
soul, I'm
We are discussing now Baruch Hashem, a perfectly healthy baby that has emerged, and we are discussing now the implications of
the actualization of the soul. In other words, the soul it's there, it's just not working until you...
That's right. We're talking now of the actualization of the soul. Now, the question of when the soul entered is not for our discussion. We are now coming to the conclusion, according to the Zohar in Parshat Tazria, that the actualization of the soul becomes on the 8th day. All right? Therefore, another aspect, only from my own experience, and I'd like to share that with you, is in many cases, the doctor and little boys come out, and many times, maybe more cases than none, they are a little yellow. There is no greater klipa, and I use the word klipa, I'm not using it loosely. I have never seen a greater klipa on behalf of the doctors to immediately delay the circumcision. I have found the reverse when it comes to performing a kind of operation which involves $2,000, $3,000, $50,000. speed is and the necessity and the immediacy of it is so prevalent. I mean, you can't wait another day. However, when it comes to this aspect, I see it's always the reverse. Delay. And therefore, in concluding this first session, one should depend on a very competent mohel. He knows more than the doctor in that respect of whether the child is prepared or capable of handling the Brit Milah or not. And it should not be left to the doctor. If the mohel says it should be left to the doctor, then it should be left to the doctor. But the one who should be consulted first and foremost is the mohel. And we'll come back. We'll have a short break.
I have two problems here. I guess one.
Just to quote the Zohar, and it is a subject matter that will be discussed again at a later date, and that is concerning the Pidyon Haben. We will have a session on Pidyon Haben. Again, it is considered to be a precept, and therefore 90% of Jews do not have to observe it. The minute you hear the word precept, especially if you're Persian, that's the last thing you want to hear about, right? But in any event, when you hear the word precept, you know that's religion, and that's something you never really want to, get close to. We will discuss that more fully, but I just want to touch on this one aspect, that B'yom HaShmini, and I'm quoting from the Zohar in Parshat Tazria, page 9. B'yom HaShmini, what happens at B'yom HaShmini? Chozer haruach v'haguf leheroet lefnei hamalka ulitkasher ba ubedacha dahainu b'zeh erampin beguf v'ruach. In other words, what happens on that eighth day? What happens on that eighth day? Because the vessel has been established, the vessel that can deal and handle the soul, on the eighth day, not on the seventh, not on the ninth, but on that eighth day, the body and soul come together as one unified whole, and the ruach is yashev beguf. And here he goes into the aspect of what Pidyon Haben is. In other words, what is the purpose of a Pidyon Haben? But in general, what we are discussing here, for the purpose of our discussion, that these 8 days provide the forum by which the soul and the body will become united. That by no means, says the Zohar, is the end of the scenario between the body and the soul. Because he says you need 30 days before Haruach Ein Mishkano Shoneh Beguf Kibisha Yamim. The 8th day is indicated by the Zohar as where they now merge into one unified whole. But as we know from other teachings in the Kabbalah, that the soul and the body are diametrically opposed to each other. There's a dichotomy. That dichotomy, in fact, exists throughout a person's lifetime. We speak of schizophrenia. You ask a psychiatrist what it's all about. He doesn't know. That's why if it's acute, forget it, right? But that's not true. That's not true. I can attest to it. Acute does not mean it is so. I just wanted to play a little game with that, and I want to help a friend of ours who had a daughter who was acute schizophrenic, and we took her back to the hospital and to all the psychiatrists that treated, and said a miracle must have happened. She's no longer acute. Chronic. But in any event, what is that all about? Because the body has a consciousness of a desire to receive for oneself alone, and the soul has a consciousness of a desire to receive, and that's their common ground. That brings them together, because if the soul did not have an aspect of desire to receive, then how could they ever merge together? So they both have that basic intuitive quality, intrinsic quality of desire to receive. However, as opposed to the body's desire to receive for oneself alone, the soul has this intrinsic quality of a desire to receive for the sake of sharing. And the Zohar says, now that they have been brought together, now the trouble begins, because you have united two energy consciousness that are opposing. In fact, each one is making an attempt to swallow the other one. And therefore, the Pidyon Haben, which takes place, and we'll learn why that is so important, but until it takes 30 days, a completion of 30 days, before that soul settles in with the body and becomes acclimated and kind of learns all of the rough turf that it's going to encounter throughout its life. But this is the quarrel that goes on. That's why we're told we're all potential schizophrenics, right? What do you mean we're all potential? What do you mean we're all potential? So why does one yes and one no? If we're all potential, we should all be schizophrenic. What do you mean potential? Well, it didn't become actualized. What does actualization mean? If society can't deal with us, then we're actualized. If society can deal with it, don't disrupt society too much, then it's not actualized. I mean, this is so ludicrous. I mean, you determine the extent of whether one has a problem or not, and whether he can acclimate and deal with society. All right. In any event, what we are discussing insofar as circumcision is concerned, and insofar as the Pidyon Haben, or 30 days, meaning in any child, whether the child is a firstborn or not, until 30 days, the Gemara says there is always a question of whether that child will live or not. Why? Because those first 30 days are critical. Why is it critical? And it's in medical knowledge, it's true too. The first 30 days is critical. What's that?
Crib death is part of it?
No, crib death is something else. Oh, they call that because they don't know what it's about, right? Okay.
Between the 30 days, the end of the 30 days is like Yom Echad.
All right, I don't know if everybody knows what you're saying.
Well, it's a oneness.
What's that? It becomes a oneness, meaning now the soul at the end of that 30-day period has learned all of the dirty tricks of the body, and it has survived, and now it can deal with it.
Why 30 days?
It requires 30 days. Why do we need 30 days in the month? When you give me that answer, you have your answer. But you didn't ask me why there are 30 days in the month. I mean, it takes 30 days for the moon to rotate around, right? Do you know why? It's the same idea. It's the same idea. In other words, I don't want to go into that aspect because we're dealing with circumcision. I'd have to then go into a complete description of 30 days. The 30 days means a totality as well. It means 10, 10, and 10, but that wouldn't mean anything to you, right? So I'd have to go into it, and I don't want to move off the base here. Now, when a case whereby a child cannot have that brit, then someone in the intermission said, but that would be unfair. I mean, not all children are well on the 8th day, and therefore the brit is sometimes delayed, both by the mohel and the doctor. They both agree that the child is not prepared to have the circumcision.
Satan is not going to be fair.
What's that?
The Satan is not going to be fair. He's not going to wait.
Right, and that represents a problem. It does absolutely represent the problem, because he is now present. He has not been removed. He has not been, what's the expression, snipped in the bud. Right? The bud is on that 8th day. He has not. He's now been given an opportunity to entrench himself. Then, when the Olah is removed, it is like everything else, where he's gone beyond his sphere, his turf, which is the Olah, which is the foreskin. But the reason we can't question of whether it's fair or not, and I'm not saying because God in his mysterious ways knows what he's doing, because we don't accept that. But since we know that a child appears wherever he does appear based on his prior incarnation. In other words, a tikkun process for a particular child is by the producer placed in that kind of environment, those kind of circumstances, whereby he can ultimately achieve his tikkun. And part of his tikkun is to be faced with this problem of where the Satan has been given an opportunity to become entrenched, and he was not removed right at the outset. Therefore, when problems, and they will occur, and I have found that also in experience, that will only be an opportunity for that child who has studied reincarnation, that child who has studied a little about circumcision. Therefore, he will be better equipped to deal with whatever is happening, because he will know exactly why things are happening, and then not have to go off far-fetched into other areas, seeking the methods by which he can extricate himself from problems.